Today we have an incredible conversation with the creators of the upcoming Showtime documentary, Attica, Stanley Nelson and Traci. We're going to kick things off by introducing you to the AAFCA members who are taking place today, starting with Carolyn Hines in Toronto, Thomasina Farr in Philadelphia, Nancy Green in Los Angeles, Dana Abercrombie in New York, Katia Woods, our facilitator, in Philadelphia, and Jill Monroe in Los Angeles. We'll also have Rhonda Penrice joining us from Atlanta shortly. I'm gonna let you guys do what you do so well, and I will see you on the other side.
Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you so much for this film. It is eye-opening, it is heart-wrenching. The one thing that sat with me were the shots of the men stripped completely naked after the massacre and further humiliated, very reminiscent of the 1970 incident here in Philadelphia with the Black Panthers who were made to strip and march on camera. My question for you both is, were there any moments of this story that you debated being too much or second guess putting into the documentary? And Traci, we can start with you, please.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that there was any second guessing, but I think that we tried to be very deliberate and intentional in the use of those very graphic images that you see at the end of the film during the retaking. I think it is necessary if you are watching a film that is a story about how the government in an orgy of violence massacred 39 of its own citizens, that you not be allowed to walk away from that story without a very understanding on a very visceral level, the same way in which the people who actually experienced it did, what it meant. And when you send an army of people with guns who are angry, who have racial animus, who have been hearing lies about the torture of hostages, who are waiting outside the prison for days and days and days, into a prison with guns, and you tell them to shoot in a situation. And I think, we tried to kind of walk right up to that line without going past it, but it feels to me right and necessary that you walk away from that experience with that same sense of horror that all the people who lived through it felt.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was that we thought a lot about, how far to take it. And put shots in and out. We would call people into the edit room and say, hey, do you think the scene is too much? But we really wanted to show you what happened and for you to feel what happened. After we premiered the film, the Toronto Film Festival, we actually did switch out one shot, because when we saw it on the big screen, it was like, okay, that was just a little bit more than we thought it would be, but one shot we switched out. We've had a bunch of screenings so far, public screenings where Traci and I were there. Nobody has come and said, it's too much, that you took it over the edge. And so I think that we got to be real careful, but we want to take you to the edge. But we don't want you to hate us as an audience, because in many ways, you as an audience are glued to the seat, and so we don't want you to feel like we're rubbing your face in it, but we do want to show you and make you feel what happened.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I thought it was extremely well done. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Nancy Green here with Film Critique. This was very interesting to me because I remember hearing a lot about Attica when I was growing up, but nothing specifically about the prisoners, just the type of things that were already in the media as you showed in the documentary. And I found the contrast between the family members of the guards, the prisoners, and the prisoners themselves to be very interesting. So what do you have to say about that and how it works in the movie, and also with how people would basically kind of, try to put all of the prisoners into the same category when there are violent criminals, but there are also innocent people, wrongfully convicted, nonviolent criminals, and that sort of thing?
I think one of the things we wanted to do in the film was have the prisoner's character come through, have their humanity come through. And I think that you really do. I mean, you see, one of the prisoners is funny, he talks about being drunk in the yard and having fun. Others are very, very, very serious about it. Others, you can see the trauma, live still on their faces and in their voices. And so, we wanted them to be real human characters. In the same way, we felt that we wanted, the townspeople and the town to be a character, that it was part of the story, that Attica was 250 miles upstate from New York City in the middle of nowhere. It was an all-white town. And to understand what happened at Attica, I think you also have to understand the town and the mindset of the guards and of the families of the guards.
Yeah, well, I think that, there's a way in which in the current discourse that we're having around prison reform and even abolition, that we there's a tendency for us to kind of talk around the edges and the margins of that conversation. What I mean is that we kind of have that conversation in the wrongfully convicted, low-level offender places that feels very safe, it feels comfortable, it feels kind of very morally clear. But I think if we're really going to engage with what real reform looks like, you have to talk about it kind of in the middle. And that is that there are people who committed crimes, and that is why they're in prison. And that was the case for these people in Attica. And the fact that the way the system ostensibly works is that you have this balance. Someone commits a crime, and then there's punishment by having time taken away from their life, right? Like, that's how we say the justice system is supposed to work. You do not then expect that on top of that, the state dehumanizes people, deprives them of their human rights, returns them to their communities living a half-life where they don't have full rights as citizens. And, I think when you kind of sit with that part of it, you get to some really interesting answers about why crime happens and the way that we actually use prisons as sort of a band-aid for what are really social inequities. So I hope that the film will be an invitation to kind of sit in that sort of uncomfortable place and hold those two thoughts in our heads at the same time, that, like, yes, there are people who are criminals who have broken the law and they're in jail, but they do not, as they say in the film, cease to be human beings. And what do we as a society, what are we willing to continue allowing the state to do in the name of not even really making us actually safe, but making us feel safe? And are we okay with the fact that we're essentially warehousing 2 million people today in the carceral system in the United States? And so I really hope that people take the film as an opportunity to really kind of grapple with some of those difficult questions.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you so much. And that's an interesting view. And I think this movie does that. Yeah, because that was something that I was wondering about. So much appreciated.
Amazing film. One of the things that I immediately noticed was that when highlighting the prisoners and their negotiations, they were negotiating in good faith. They weren't trying to get any time taken off their sentences. They weren't trying to finagle anything as far as what they had done as their crimes. They just wanted better conditions. When you flip that and you look at the conversations that the governor and Nixon were having, and things like the officer walking out and saying white power. Can you talk to me about the dynamic of showing that the supposed criminals in this case were acting, even under these circumstances, in better faith than our leaders were throughout this entire process?
I think one of the things that's really interesting to me about that dynamic that you observed in the film is how necessary it was for the state, as embodied in Richard Nixon and Nelson Rockefeller, to kind of make this a story about unruly, criminalized Blackness, right? What you hear from the prisoners in those days in D-Yard is that, for whatever kind of stratifications they may have had within the prison, as someone said, to survive, when they were in D-Yard, they coalesced around a political identity of being prisoners. And you hear the voices of not only the Black prisoners, but white prisoners, Puerto Rican prisoners as well, saying that we are all treated horribly, and that we all recognize in this moment an opportunity to seek some of the changes that we want to see in the prison, right? But when you hear Rockefeller and Nixon on this call, The word that I use is thirsty. That's the only thing I can describe Nixon's tone when he so badly wants this to be a story about, as he says, the Blacks, right? And to my mind, as we show that, we're in this moment of law and order, this is what the wave that Nixon ultimately rides into the White House. And what that was Nixon making a promise to white voters saying, I will get these Blacks in line. I know that all of this unruly looking Blackness out in the streets terrifies you. And if you elect me, I will bring order to all of this disorderly Blackness. And so what I hear in that phone call is them trying to create an alternate narrative from the story that the prisoners were telling. And thank God they had the temerity to ask the cameras in, that says what happened on the 13th is justified because we are doing this in the name of restoring order to this criminalized, dangerous Blackness. And that is the story that they were trying to tell about what happened there during those 5 days.
I think also, the prisoners' agenda was right out front. They had no hidden agenda. They were saying what they wanted. They wanted, amnesty and better food and some other things. But they were dealing with politicians finally. And they were dealing with, in many ways, very skilled politicians in that Rockefeller has risen to be the governor of New York. Richard Nixon, throughout all odds, has become president of the United States. And so they're dealing with politicians, and the politicians have other agendas, and their agendas were not straightforward. And there's no way that the prisoners could understand that or know that, what their agendas was. Rockefeller wanted to be president, and he wanted to be seen in a different by the Republican Party. Richard Nixon wanted law and order, and he was elected on a law and order slate, and he wanted to deliver. He did, as he says, we just can't have this kind of anarchy. So I think that, the prisoners inside were playing one game, and the politicians, Nixon and Rockefeller, even Russell Oswald on the other side, were playing a different game.
Hi, Carolyn. First, here's what happened at Carolyn Talks podcast. So my question is for both you, Traci and Stanley. When I was watching this film, one thought kept occurring to me from the beginning straight up to the end was that America does not learn. And this film acts like a microcosm of the history of America from the moment that Africans were forcibly brought over from Africa to America, because there's like pictures of like the prisoners in the prison yard after the massacre where they're stripped naked and they're being marched through, which looks like the pictures that we see in history books and in museums of Africans being held on slave blocks and that into the ships. And then there's like the discussion of the war in Vietnam, of how Black soldiers were sent across to Vietnam while dealing with racism in America, coming back facing racism, but then how their experiences there allowed them to function during this standoff during the riots, because they built latrines, they had medical training, you had lawyers, you had people who had like worked lives outside of prison, and like all in this I kept getting is like Black people still have to face like bigotry and racism from the people in charge of the society outside of prison and inside of prison. So could you just talk about how this film kind of like encapsulates so much of America's history and the way it mistreats Black people and those from marginalized communities?
One of the things I was thinking about earlier today is that in some ways, if you're a Black person and you watch this film, it almost should not be shocking, right? Like there's something about a righteous challenge to the injustice of the state and against the way that the state abuses its power, and the state's response to that challenge with violence that is in many ways the story of Black people in this country since we got here. I mean, there's nothing more consistent in the Black story than that. But I think that, I thought what you said is really interesting, because not only is there this sort of historical connection to the past and what happened before at Attica, but there's a connection that moves forward into the future and right now where we are in the present, right? Like that same image of the guys that someone describes as looking like the slave ships, that image, there are photos that came out of Rikers Island 2 weeks ago, the jail in New York where we've been hearing horrific stories of what's been going on there, where there's one a prison cell meant to hold one person, and they're the bodies of 26 people that have arranged themselves so they take up just enough room that their bodies can take up in this one cell. And it looks just like that same photo, right? And there's a direct connection between the events that we see in Attica and where we see ourselves today, because of course, Nelson Rockefeller, before he goes on to become vice president of the United States, he passes the Rockefeller drug laws, which are these infamous draconian drug laws that are then replicated throughout the country and ultimately fuels the explosion of not only the prison population, but the actual number of prisons in the country. So I think, there's a temptation when you start telling a historical story like this to kind of see it as this fossilized moment in history. But I think that you're right. I think that what we do in the film is that we sort of excavated from that history, and particularly with everything that happened in 2020, and we kind of put it in conversation with what we see happening today. And I think it can inform a lot of our understanding about not only what we're seeing, but also what we should expect about how the state is going to respond to what I think are going to be increasing challenges to those injustices.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that you started out with saying is that, America doesn't learn. And I think that in many cases, it doesn't, it just erases the past or it misconstrues the past. Hopefully the film in its little way kind of clears up some of that.
I think it does. I completely agree. And I did think of that those pictures from Rikers Island, because I was thinking of people like Khalif Browder, who died while he was in lockup, and like these men who were held like on minor charges for hundreds of days without any contact from their families, and they're sending notes to like the nurse that visited them, and like there are scenes like that in the film that kind of like echo that as well. So I think the film does reveal a lot of stuff about undoing a lot of erasure that has been done with history, because like there's things that can't be denied, like there's the video evidence, thank goodness, and the picture evidence. So I thank you both so much for creating this film, because I think it's important that a lot of people learn about how awful the American government and law enforcement has been to people in various situations.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's central to the film is that the prisoners really quickly after taking the prison over, invite the press in and say that they need the press. They want the press to come in. They want the cameras to come in, and they want the reporters to come in. And so the reporters come in and film. And though that photographic evidence and film evidence exists, and so that it allows us to make the film. And it's really important because they're great. Look, we have great subjects in the film and great faces and great statements and great people talking about it. But, combined with the visual element that you see, that's what I think makes the film so powerful, because the footage, I mean, I've done a number of historical films, and I've never seen anything like the footage that we use in this film. I mean, it's just amazing.
Thank you.
Hello, Dana Abercrombie from the Koalition. The term Attica, for me, I was first introduced, was kind of in pop media. It's used in other TV shows or movies anytime they're going to protest Attica. My question is, was there any discussions either amongst the people you interviewed or amongst yourself about how something that was so incredibly serious and that was heartbreaking what actually occurred is now used as a punchline in media today?
I don't think that we had those conversations. I mean, I will say that, this happened before I was born, so I didn't know very much about it, but I was very much aware, as I think all of us are, about the line, which I think you might be referencing in the Dog Day Afternoon film, where Al Pacino's character says Attica. And for me, it was less sort of thinking about it as, a punchline than, wondering, what was it about this event that made it so resonant in the culture that the mere mention of this word in this scene, without explaining anything else, is able to evoke a mood and a feeling, and all these sort of thoughts about it. So I think to the extent that I had any kind of engagement or understanding with how Attica exists in the popular culture, that probably was what it was.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that we knew early on that we wanted this film to exist in Attica in 1971, and we didn't want to break that tension. We didn't want to break that, and we wanted it to stay there. You know, we could, of course, you know, flashed up and you know, Attica's just like Rikers Island today, or you know, some other things that we could have done. But I think that the film really is much more tense if we take you back there and let you live back there for 5 days with the prisoners and with the people who were trying to figure out what exactly to do and what exactly was happening in Attica.
Dr. Wood's Cup of Soul show. And one of the things that really struck me about this film is that it wasn't necessarily a Black people problem. It was a prisoner problem. It was the Black inmates and the white inmates talked about how they were treated unfairly, how they were dehumanized, how they, you know, especially after the guards came back in and retook the prison, and how there was, you know, some reform, but then it went back to it. And even the families of the officers that were killed were like, there were so many things that were wrong. I think for the first time where you have people from law enforcement families and people from the prisoners were in accordance with what was going on there. How did you feel like, you know, just doing the interviews and all of that? Because that seems to be like a message coming around that they all felt from the top down that this was not handled properly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, obviously the prisoners and the guards who are hostages are going to have some different perspectives and understanding about what they, you know, experienced during those 5 days in DR. But one of the things that everybody can agree on is that they were all ultimately harmed by the state of New York. I mean, you hear in the film, D. Quinn Miller, whose father actually was killed by prisoners, say at the end that she expected and didn't receive an apology from the state. And that's because leading up to this, the guards who worked in the prison actually tried to alert the administration in the Department of Corrections that something was going to happen. And they asked for help, and the state did nothing. So this was a dereliction of duty on the part of the Corrections Department and the state of New York. And they also can all agree on the fact that there was never any justice done for them. There was no one prosecuted. The state did not make any effort to really go after the people that did this. There was an attempt, and there was a cover up, and then no one was ever actually prosecuted for it. There was 30 years of legal battles just to get the settlement that they did get. And I think what you see in the film is that, you know, for whatever pretense the state made about needed to go and rescue the hostages, ultimately the hostages were also killed, the employees of the state, right? So I think that sort of brushes away any idea that, you know, they cared about what happened to these prisoners. And I think all of them recognize that whether you are a hostage or you are a prisoner on September 13th, your life was ultimately disposable when it came to the state needing to reassert its power and its dominance over the prisoners who were making these demands.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really also what's important is there was no real plan to free the hostage. You know, there was no plan that could have possibly worked. It wasn't like there was a plan that went wrong. There was no plan. You know, there was a plan to shoot gas into the prison, to knock people out, knock people down. But when you shoot the gas, you know, it creates smoke, so you can't see what you're doing. And then they just fired into the yard, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. You know, so it's really important to understand that there was no way, there was no plan to save the hostages. There was just a plan to fire them all up and you know, what do they say, you know, just shoot everybody and sort them out later.
Hi, Rhonda, Lachey Penrice here. I am curious in this climate of critical race theory hysteria, how do you think subject matter like Attica will fare going forward?
You know, I actually think that in many ways, it's a great time to release Attica. I think that the kind of blind trust of law enforcement in many instances, for many people, dissipated. We know now that the police lie. We know now that the police kill. And maybe everybody on the Zoom call already knew that, but I think within the last 5 years or so, much more of the public knows that. And if a certain portion of the public doesn't know that and doesn't believe that, nothing you can do will change their minds. So I think in some ways the window is cracked a little bit for some understanding of an event like Attica, because there is some doubt for so many people about law enforcement.
Thomasina Farrar again, musicmoviestores.com. I want to ask you both again, were there any parts to the story while you were researching and developing this project that you really had a visceral reaction to, or something that surprised or shocked even you?
The whole thing shocked me. I mean, I like everybody, I knew some of the story, like so many people, but the layers were peeled back. I think, the what I call the casual racism of the prisoners being called nigger constantly, as the guy says, nigger, that was your name that day, to the guards, yelling white power to the president of the United States, talking about, was it the blacks? Was it the blacks? So much, shocked me, and like everybody else, it's really interesting because one of the things that people always talk about is the nude pictures of the guys, with their hands on their head, the abject surrender and the torture, and in some ways it's really interesting because there's much more talk about that than there is to the actual killing, because it's just torture, and it's just revenge, and I'm not even sure why it affects us as humans as it does, but it's really fascinating that those pictures are what people constantly go back to in screenings and in interviews, because they're so shocking. And then I remember the first time I saw the pictures, I was just like, what are these? And it's so those still shock, and every time I see the film, they're still shocked.
I agree with Stanley. The whole thing is shocking, but I think what is particularly striking are the things in the film that are perhaps unexpected. I think, most of our understanding of prisoners and people in prison, what you would expect is that when, a riot happens, which, I think is a fair word to describe the early moments of the rebellion in those 5 days, that these are criminals and there's going to be chaos and anarchy and violence. And that is all that would have happened in that yard in this moment when the prisoners had this opportunity for relative freedom. And so I think what is surprising is the extraordinary way in which they were quickly able to create order out of all that chaos and organize the yard and create a sanitary system there and medical care, and to have democratic elections, and just kind of the quickness with which the intelligence that was there that allowed them to recognize the opportunity that they had in this moment, and this speed with which they were able to turn what started as a riot into a rebellion and an uprising. And I also think, like Stanley said, I think, I think there's a sense of dread that you can feel throughout the film that something is going to happen, that there's going to be some conflict, there's going to be some violence. The prisoners themselves felt it. They didn't think that this was going to end with them just kind of, just tra-la-la and skip back into your cell. But as you hear them say, they sort of thought this was going to be a fair fight, basically, that, the police were going to come in with some sticks and they had whatever things in the yard and they were going to fight it out. One guy told me, like, I knew karate, so I thought I was going to be good. And I think what is shocking and what is unexpected, what was for them and what it is for me, and I think any viewer, is the degree to which the violence happened during the retaking. And not only the part that initially subdued the prisoners, but that it continues into this torture and the way that the hatred manifested itself in this orgy of violence. I just don't think anybody expects that. I mean, I certainly didn't, and it was very, very shocking, continues to be shocking to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as Traci was talking, I thought of something that I kind of hadn't really thought of it in a clear way before. I mean, I think the prisoners thought that when they came back, when they took back the prison, that the objective was going to be to take back the prison, right? That law enforcement objective was to take back the prison, but that wasn't the objective of law enforcement. Law enforcement wanted revenge. They wanted to humiliate the prisoner. They wanted to kind of get off. They wanted to let out their own rage. In what ended up a killing frenzy, and the objective to take back the prison was lost because that was easily done. Again, the prisoners had no guns at all.
Hi, Nancy Green here again. And one thing that I was thinking about while I was watching the movie, as you mentioned, that scene when the guards come in and they're shooting up all the prisoners and you hear, go to your nearest guard, you will not be harmed. It reminded me so much of a sort of dystopian a sci-fi movie in which you just see complete chaos, and that is the order of the day. And now as we move into different technologies, when it concerns prison reform, and you're looking at things like facial recognition technology, which has been found to have some racial issues. I was reading about something having to do with having technology that would make it feel like a prisoner was in jail for 1,000 years when they were only there for 8 hours. And I wanted to know, what can something like Attica teach us, as we see that history tends to repeat itself with things like this? So how can Attica teach us things that maybe can be avoided in the future?
I don't think that I know the answer to that. I mean, I don't know. I tend to think that the film doesn't necessarily offer any answers. I mean, all of these issues of, the prison system and police abuses and injustices, these are all very thorny things, and they're certainly not going to be addressed by one film. But what I do hope is that the film invites people to kind of ask some of those difficult questions, like the ones that you asked, and really sit with and grapple with it in a way that is not distant and indifferent, but that is engaged and clear-eyed, and takes into account the voices and the humanity of the people who are in prisons.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if the film just makes people think after it's over about prisons, about prisoners, about the 2 million people that are in prison today, then I think in some ways it's done its job. Prisons are there so that we put people away far from the cities, and we don't have to think about them. So if we do think about people in prison for just a little bit, I think the film is doing its job.
Jill Monroe again. So my question is, with so many stories to tell within this, was there a story that initially, when you began the project, putting it together, you thought would be included in the film that did not make it to the final project?
Traci, that's your
Sure. I mean, there's always, this is a story that really honestly could be a multi-part series, right? And so there's always things that you wish that you had time for, and little asides and moments that are really exciting. But I think ultimately we had to focus on telling the most compelling, honest, incisive version of the story that we were telling, which is the story of these 5 days, using the most powerful and compelling material that we had at hand in the interviews and the archival. And so Sure, there's always, a million things that like shoulda, coulda, woulda, I wish we had more time for, but ultimately we just had to focus on the story that we were telling and the best possible way to tell it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were really fortunate in working, with Showtime that we had a budget that we could work with, and we were able to stretch out the time because of COVID, but we were able to do it, and we made the film we wanted to make. I don't sit there and think about things that we could have included or didn't include, and if you talk to me about it, you would think I was crazy, because it's like, just one, I wish we could have made that shot longer, or I wish the music came in 1 second earlier than it did. But it's not, any big thing. I mean, we had time to think about the film. I've learned because I've made a few films that we want to really put money into editing, to have enough time to edit the film and make the film we want to make, and so that we don't have regrets, because the film is a document. It's now a lasting document. It's history, and we can't go back and change it. And so we want to make it, as perfect as we possibly can. And I'm not saying it's a perfect film, but it's the best that we could do, for sure.
Hi, Carolyn again. So again, this question is for both of you. And I want you to talk a bit about dealing with the trauma that these former prisoners had to go through. And because in the film, like you talked about like the graphic images and like you meant, and like people talk about the pictures, but like the main crux of the whole situation was that 39 people were slaughtered. And this happened in front of men who were in a situation where they were outside for 5 days under extreme conditions. Many of them had like traumatic experiences in their past. Like some of them, like we mentioned, were Vietnam vets. So they would have seen death and destruction in the war. And then to be in that situation again, you had like an army helicopter dropping tear gas on them. And so to be like, they're in a mini war zone. And so could you just talk about how you and your crew dealt with any traumatic situations that could have occurred during the interview process? Because I could imagine like talking about it could have been difficult for some of the interviewees, because like one of them, he mentions, and forgive me for not mentioning his name, like he said something that struck me with me. Like he said there was a moment where he realized like, I'm the one that's locked up, but I'm looking at the real monsters, right? And he's talking about how like these men are monsters and they're allowed to govern them, they're allowed to be in control of their lives. So and like you could tell that was something that was very hard for him to deal with. So could you just talk about handling the emotional toll that doing the interviews could have taken on the interviewees?
Yeah, I think, from the very beginning, I was mindful of that exact thing. In the very first conversation that I had with each of these people, long before we ever went on camera, I acknowledged that to them, that I recognized that this was a profoundly traumatic event for all of the people, not just the prisoners, but everyone, even the observers who experienced it. You hear that moment at the end where Clarence Jones says he will never, ever, 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 ever forget it. And he was in and out. He was in there as an observer. So it's something that I acknowledge my understanding of to them from the very beginning, and continue to sort of let them know that like I see that. And I understood it. And yeah, you're right. The trauma, this is not just trauma, but an unhealed trauma for almost all of these people. Most of these people have had no kind of therapy or counseling or anything for what they experienced. And all of that emotion that I think you see that comes through the screen in the film was very much there at the surface for every single one of these people. There were very few interviews where there were not a lot of crying. There were few interviews where, and I think this also comes through in the film, the rage over the injustice of what happened to them was right there at the surface, because I think what happened on the 13th was the ultimate dehumanization. And that's all they were, really asking for, was a recognition of their humanity. And that does something to your soul when that happens to you. Also the recognition that this is your own government that did that to you. And so I think there's, I think when anybody experiences something that is attached to very, 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 very powerful emotion, it kind of cements itself into your memory. And so I think you really see that come across in the film, particularly those moments where the different men describe one thing the same way, like that helicopter flying over, telling them that no one's going to be harmed as they see this like horrific violence happening all around them. So it was certainly something that I tried to be sensitive to. For many of these people, for the last 50 years, September 9th through September 13th is a very difficult and triggering time for them every single year, every year. And so I just tried to kind of sit with them in that. I mean, I think your instinct, any human being, when you see someone else suffering, is to sort of want to reach out and stop it. And so part of my work was to kind of suppress that instinct and just sort of be there in silent recognition and support in the interviews, but also to kind of step back and allow them to the space to feel it and express it and say it however they want. You know, a lot of the guys, when I came in, and they're, you know, we're still trying to kind of help them understand like what the bigger picture of this film is going to be, because you only sort of see your one interview, and they're like, they would use some profanity and say like, oh, I'm sorry. And I'm like, nope, this is your space. Say it the way you want to say it. If like there's a curse word in there, then go on and let it fly. This is cable, premium cable, and it's okay. So a lot of that was just like really making people feel comfortable, and just kind of giving them the space to let them know that I see you, I hear you, and this is a safe space for you to be able to speak honestly about what happened to you. And that goes for the prisoners as well as the families and everyone else that's in the film.
Yeah, one of the things that we did was we had a screening of the film at the Apollo Theater in New York, where we brought as many as of the prisoners involved to the screening as we possibly could, and we had a therapist there that they could talk to, and you know, we let people know that there was a therapist, and you know, she's going to be, you know, in the back at this seat, and if you know you're feeling something or other, you know, she's there for you to talk to. So we did do that at the screening where many of the former prisoners saw the film for the first time.
Dana Abercrombie again. I was wondering, especially for you, Traci, you talked a little bit about kind of the trauma and how you was able to prepare them for what, you know, to re-talking about it again. I was wondering, as documentarians, how do you walk away from something that is so particularly heavy, and the fact that you're involved in the research, I'm assuming for many months? What do you do for yourself as a documentarian?
That's a good question. You know, there's this this saying that I always think about in my work, that what you work on works on you. And I have found that to be true in all of my work, and especially so with this. One of the Attica prosecutors has written a book, Malcolm Bell, and there's a line in there that he says, Attica has a way of holding people. And I have found that to be true for every single person that has touched that story, people that have made films about that story. It's certainly true for me. And so in some ways it doesn't really leave you. But weirdly enough, because, you know, we made this film in a whole pandemic, in some way the work and the focus that was demanded and the attention that was demanded by it was a distraction from all the other horrible things that were going on outside of our little pandemic boxes. So, you know, it was a therapeutic distraction in a weird way, even as it was extremely difficult to, you know, obviously sit with all of the images that you see at the end, and also sit with people's pain and trauma. But I kind of felt like if I was asking all of these people to relive it for the sake of this film, the least I could do was, you know, experience it and be in it with them as much as I could as a filmmaker.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, you know, is that I kind of am able to go into my filmmaker head, you know, and I'm making a film, and, you know, and I think that's, you know, partially for me what saves me. And you know, it's a strange thing, you know, because when you're interviewing somebody and somebody cries, you know, you're very sympathetic. But also, you know, part of you is thinking, you know, oh, you know, this is going to be great for the film. You know, and that's just brutally honest, you know, and you can't help but feel that. And you try, you know, as a human being, I'm trying to balance that. because I don't want to be that guy, I don't want to be that guy. So it's just a matter of trying to balance it and yeah.
Thank you so much.
Let's hear again. One of the things that I do like about this film is as uncomfortable and disturbing as it is, it does remind us that we are still having these issues. And I think, one thing again in this film that was very obvious is that you had prisoners with different degrees of criminal background and different circumstances. We still are, one thing that did hone through is that we're still using prison as a means to cope with mental issues, addiction, all of these things, all these veterans that were coming back from Vietnam addicted, just suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome and all of that. We're still going for the result, not the cause. And why do you think that, even though we're having semi-talk about the opioid crisis, we're still not in a place where we understand that prison is something that doesn't rehabilitate? It kind of like, some people have said, I went into prison semi-normal, I came out a complete animal. And I'm not saying that to dehumanize anybody. Why do you think is that we're not learning that?
I think that, we have more and more that, certain sections of our population, black and brown people, are thought of as fully human. And, this society works if we have part of the population that's thrown away. So in many cases, people are put in prison, but they give jobs to, the rural communities. I know at one point, I'm not sure if it still exists this way, but the prison guard union in California was the largest lobbying group in the state of California. And what they lobby for is more and more prisons and harsher sentences so that they can have jobs, and so I think that, look, we can trace it back to times of enslavement, and for most of the people, there's no jobs for them. There's no place in society. I look at the guys in the film and I think about how, from the time they were born, their whole lives were kind of funneling them into the prison system, and that's what they were funneled into. And, you see the intelligence, and the humanness of these guys in the film, and that there could have been a whole different path for them and a whole different life for them. Certainly you see, the humanity of Big Black and of LD, and that there could have been another path for them. But there's no path for so many people of color in this country, as this country's set up now.
Yeah, I think that, you can't ignore the influence of capitalism. It always will prioritize profits over people, and that is no different in the prison system. There is a lot of money to be made in prisons. There's a huge financial incentive to not only keep the system that we have, but also grow it bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's not only private prisons where there's literally a price tag on every prisoner that goes in there, and these businesses make money, but the prison industrial complex, there are all of these companies that live in this ecosystem of the prison system, and everybody's making money off of it. So there's an incentive to do that. There's not so much an incentive to really think about the ways in which we use prisons as a Band-Aid solution for what are really social and political inequities, right? Like the causes of crime are not unknowable. We know this. There's reams of research about this. And when you get down to it, it's things like education and jobs and poverty and opportunity and healthcare and all of those, problems that, from what I see, it seems like we're not willing to really make an honest effort at trying to fix. So to me, I think the financial incentive is, I won't say always, I don't want to be fatalist about it, but that just sort of is how capitalism works.
Piggybacking on Stanley and Traci, what you were just talking about, having worked on Attica, are you optimistic? If so, why? If not, why not?
Optimistic about what?
The future, change.
Yeah, I'm always optimistic. I mean, in the long run, if you ask me if I'm optimistic, this month or today, nah. But I think in the future, I am optimistic. I think that we have to be. I think that more and more and more young people, see that there's a problem. See that there's problems in this country, and want change. And I have to believe that it's their turn now, and they'll continue and push and make change. So in the long run, maybe I'm a fool, but I have to be optimistic. It's kind of like that's the only thing we got. Is our optimism and our need for change and our push for change.
Yeah, I would say same, a combination of both. Am I optimistic that the government of its own volition is going to do anything to reform, undo, change this system? No. Like I said, there's just too much of a, if anything else, financial, if not political incentive to keep growing the system larger and larger. But I am encouraged, like Stanley said, by the young people who seem to be recognizing in a way that generations before maybe hadn't so much, that the system is untenable. And I'm encouraged by what I see in the discourse around prisons and the justice system, where we have things like reform and even abolition, right, which had been these sort of marginalized as these wackadoo pie in the sky, could never happen ideas, move to the closer to the center of that dialogue. And I'm also very encouraged by the fact that so much of the people that have laid the groundwork and done this work, particularly when it comes to abolition, are Black women. And so I always bet on Black women. And so, those things are very, very encouraging to me.
Yeah, I think that's a good bet. Always.
Stanley and Traci, kudos to you both for this remarkable piece of work. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
On behalf of the world's largest group of Black film critics, thank you for watching this edition of AAFCA Roundtables. Have a great day.